Call of Duty Infinite Warfare is the fifth modern Call of Duty game developed by Infinity Ward, the company that made one game everyone loved, one game everyone but me loved, and have since been occupying their time trying to see how quickly they can destroy any and all goodwill they've built up to this point. Shit, I remember when Treyarch was considered the bad Call of Duty developer, but lately it seemed as though they've risen to the top of the old bottle of milk that is Call of Duty in 2016. Granted, I don't necessarily think that the drop in quality was entirely the fault of the developers, as their recent games were sort of fucked from the word go. I think there are a lot of extremely talented people working on Infinity Ward, and I don't think all of the issues with their games rest solely on their shoulders. I mean, they're clearly very resourceful, given that they appear to have used their three most recent games to fuel the dumpster fire of a story on display here. And yes, I'm going to talk about the story, and I'm going to spoil it, because even if the Venn diagram of people who watch my videos and people who care about the story of Call of Duty had enough people in either circle to exist in the first place, I can't imagine there'd be enough overlap to be all that concerned about. And for anyone out there who says they do care about the story of Call of Duty 29, I just want to say that I'm sorry and to stick in there, because things do get better in high school. Call of Duty you know, the more I say that subtitle out loud, the more I realize just how fucking paced it is. What the hell is Infinite Warfare even supposed to mean? Were you counting the amount of people who had to fuck up for this game to get made in the first place, or had the executives just marathon the Toy Story movies and felt an inspiration that lasted long enough to remember the catchphrases but fell just short of including all the good writing? Or is Infinite Warfare supposed to be a reference to the fact that some of the game takes place in space and space is infinite? If that's the case, then I sure hope there's a fountain in your roundabout, because I think my head's about to catch fire. Call of Duty's Snake in My Boot Warfare opens the way that every Call of Duty game seems to nowadays. The game drops you in as a minor character who you play as to learn the basic mechanics and who is invariably killed off by the big bad in order to set the stakes. And this mission immediately reminded me of why I've hated every Call of Duty campaign since World at War. They're both absurdly predictable and completely joyless, much like a certain game reviewer I know. And you know what? The whole joyless thing would be totally fine if they treated war with any baseline level of actual respect, but instead we're given a clusterfuck that's about as consistent in tone as the song Hysteria as played by actual Def Leopards. The phrase "have your cake and eat it too" comes to mind, but I'm in the mindset of a Call of Duty player at the moment and metaphors scare me, so for now I'll just say that in future Call of Duty games I'd appreciate it if the writers would pick a tone and stick to it. I mean, if you're going to let us fly around and shoot robots with a gun called the R3KT, you should probably write a story that doesn't feel horribly disingenuous alongside that. But no, Activision wants us all to know that this game is serious. It's dead serious. It's Halo Reach machinima serious, and as a result, it can only be taken about that seriously. In addition to introducing the gameplay and the big bad, this first mission also has the job of explaining the central conflict of the plot. That being that in the far-flung future of some year, Earth has established settlements throughout the solar system who seem to live under military jurisdiction. Upset by their lack of representation in government, the settlements form the Settlement Defense Front and revolt against the United Nations Space Alliance. Oh shit, is this what I think it is? Villains with an empathetic cause? Are they giving the player some credit? Oh! No, they made Jon Snow Space Hitler. Never mind, false alarm, everyone go back to sniffing your gasoline. Why would you give the villains of your game a sympathetic cause if you didn't want the player to sympathize with them? It almost seems like there were two writers working together on the story here. I'll just call them Activision and Infinity Ward. One of the writers had the idea to give the opposition a cause that the player could relate to so that the story could revolve around the layers of problems and all of the very real moral implications of fighting a war against people you used to associate with, and the other is scared of accents and loud noises. And on a tangentially related note, if you're going to make the villain an irredeemable evil force of intimidation, why in the world would you cast Jon fucking Snow to play the role? Don't get me wrong, I like Kit Harington as much as the next girl, but if I had to make a list of the most intimidating actors in Hollywood, he'd fall somewhere between Jesse Eisenberg and the dog from Beverly Hills Chihuahua. The man looks like he's constantly on the verge of bursting into tears. He doesn't look like he wants to overthrow the Earth's government. He looks like he wants a hug. It's at this point in the story, this point being the beginning of the actual story, that we are introduced to all of our major characters. There's the player character, Reyes, a man so generic that you could slot him into anything from NCIS to Alien 14 and he'd fit in seamlessly. Omar, a black man who's robot racist until he isn't anymore. Ethan, a robot with a southern accent and a quite frankly worrying amount of anti-robot tech. And Girl, who is a girl. Now, there are a few other minor characters that are thrown in around this time, but quite frankly, none of them matter because it's evident that all of the work was put toward making the player care about a piece of metal with no soul in a southern accent. Which of those would be a bigger reason not to care is your call. And you know what? I did care, but that's only because the game cheated and I am a massive pussy. Having an artificial intelligence saying anything along the lines of, "I think I'm scared," is a cheap but effective way to make me give a shit about them. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt that he got the largest slice of the solitary personality that every character was apparently forced to share, meaning that the robot is the least robotic character in the entire cast, and I'm honestly at a loss to whether that's good or bad writing. On the one hand, it means the writers were able to make me care about a character with no face, who isn't even strictly speaking alive, but on the other hand, the rest of the cast was so wooden that I'm honestly shocked they weren't set ablaze when their circuit shorted out. In any case, it doesn't really matter given the fact that any points the game earns for Ethan are immediately deducted by the sheer amount of paste in this story. You know how I mentioned the line, "I think I'm scared," a minute ago? Well, that's something that Ethan says to Reyes as the two are free-floating in space while Reyes' suit is leaking the last of his oxygen with no help in sight. This is all following a bit of dialogue where Ethan explains that he's just expendable hardware, so when he said, "I think I'm scared," and the screen blurred to black, in spite of myself, I felt genuinely affected by it. That is, I did feel genuinely affected by it until the game faded back into light with Reyes waking up in a med bay with the only explanation being Ethan is a robot. And if you listen closely during this scene, you can actually hear the last minuscule bit of narrative tension sputter into nothingness because apparently the UNSA is staffed entirely by time-traveling wizards. In addition to completely destroying any kind of personal stakes the game had established up to that point, it also neuters the impact of the character's actual deaths later on. I imagine that having to manually self-destruct Ethan to complete the final mission would have been pretty impactful if I still gave a baker's fuck at that point. Not to mention the fact that in the final mission, the vacuum of space suddenly remembers that being fatal is sort of its thing, at least whenever the plot requires it to be. Your story is internally inconsistent, Infinity Ward. This is the same shit that took me out of Twilight and the Bible. Actually, you know what? If I had to use one word to describe the experience of playing Infinite Warfare as a whole, it'd probably be mistake, but inconsistent would be a close second. The cutscene switch between being rendered on the fly in first person and pre-rendered incredibly compressed cinematics. Your control settings don't carry over from campaign to zombies to multiplayer, and the game can't seem to decide if it wants to run perfectly fine or stutter like a game reviewer when confronted with a social situation. And yeah, I have used that joke in a review before, but if the game with a near infinite budget gets to recycle emotional beats in its story, then fuck you and the robotic horse you rode in on, so do I. Also, as a quick little side note, I'd avoid cranking the FOV up to fun if immersion is in any way important to you. There's so much inherently wrong with the way the story was written that I don't even know how to structure my thoughts on it without making the review longer than the campaign itself. So instead, I'll just talk about the actual missions themselves. By which I of course mean talk about the two missions that were distinct enough for me to remember for reasons other than the color of their skybox while flailing wildly at the noisy, vaguely patriotic blur that is the rest of the campaign. You know, real hard-hitting analysis shit. The first mission takes place when Adolf Snow attacks Earth and begins actively committing war crimes on Geneva. In case him saying compassion is a weakness and shooting one of his own men for no reason was a touch too subtle for you. During this mission, every time you pick up a new gun, you're given a brief explanation of what the gun does, as well as a list of special features like alternate firing modes and... This mission is split into two sections, one in which you run around the city shooting guns at bad guys and robots, and one in which you fly around in a spaceship shooting even bigger guns at bad guys and robots. And credit where it's due, I was actually very surprised by the amount of depth in the spaceship combat. Sure, it overstays its welcome a little bit, but it's clear that a lot of thought and care went into crafting these mechanics for this section. There's no denying that the change between boots on the ground combat and spaceflight is giving the player quite a bit of variety in gameplay right off the bat. Infinity Ward earned a lot of bonus points from me for this, or at least they did earn a lot of bonus points for it before I realized that I was going to be spending about a third of my playtime in these spaceships, and during that hour and a half, it slowly started to dawn on me that I had about as much input in what was going on in-game as a United States citizen has in a presidential election. And now that I've effectively sabotaged the rating of this video, I can finally talk about the one mission that I actually really liked, because believe it or not, there is one of those. Operation Dark Quarry is far and away the best mission in the entire game, and while that endorsement may sound about as meaningful as calling someone the single greatest mathematician on bus 124 right this second, I actually mean it as a genuine compliment. The biggest thing that set this mission apart for me is the fact that the setting has an actual impact on the gameplay. Dark Quarry takes place in a mining facility on an asteroid near Mercury that is spinning out of control, and this is good for 4 reasons. The first reason is that this means that there is no spaceship combat section, which elevates it above most of the other campaign missions right off the bat. The second, and arguably most important reason, is the fact that this is the only mission in the entire game where the setting actually matters. Because the asteroid is so close to
to the sun, you take damage when being hit by direct sunlight. So you have to time your movements around the outdoor areas right and sprint through while the asteroid is shading your path. And yeah, it isn't exactly challenging, but this one simple change works wonders in making you feel like you're actually in the intended setting and not just a lunatic running around the mountain somewhere with a lighting gel stuck to your face. The third reason this setting is so great is because this mission isn't set in a war zone, so instead of fighting countless soldiers, you're fighting security and worker bots that were hacked by the SDF and trying to reach the last surviving miners that are holed up trying to hide from them. Lots of the robots don't have weapons, so they move and fight differently than everything else in the game, which makes fighting large groups of them very frantic and exciting because they are constantly moving closer instead of hiding behind cover and popping up and down every few seconds. It's exciting and fun in ways that every other mission fails to be, and that stems from the fact that it offers actual variety in its gameplay. The fourth and final reason that this mission is so good is because it's downright fucking gorgeous and visually thematic as hell. And speaking of things being thematic, let's get back on track with things that are wildly inconsistent and talk briefly about the zombies mode, which inexplicably takes place in the 1980s at a theme park and follows around 4 horror film stereotypes. And if that doesn't just scream futuristic space shooter, then quite frankly, I don't know what does. Now, being someone who was born in the 90s and is an absolute cunt, I have a lot of secondhand nostalgia for the 80s, so disregarding the fact that everything about this game mode clashes so spectacularly with the rest of the game, I actually kind of enjoyed it. I should probably mention that my all-time favorite Call of Duty Zombies map is the original one due to its simplicity, but I can definitely understand why lots of people would prefer these larger and more complicated levels. However, I don't really have much else to say about it due to the fact that in the entire time I spent playing the game, I was only able to find 2 matches that lasted about 15 minutes each. And while I'm sure I'd enjoy the shit out of it if I had 3 friends who were all just as bad with their money as I am, I can't exactly recommend purchasing the entire game based on what little I've played of it. And with that, it's time to talk about the multiplayer, and I'm having a lot of trouble coming up with funny or interesting things to say about it, so I'm just going to try and work as many of the map names into this part of the review as possible so I don't concuss myself when I fall asleep and subsequently slam my head into the desk. Now, it's not really a secret that Call of Duty isn't exactly on the frontier of pioneering game design for first-person shooters. I actually can't think of a time since the first Modern Warfare that Call of Duty hosted the genesis of a major innovation, despite the fact that everyone who plays this game sounds as though they're located somewhere in the Bible Belt. In fact, I've been told that a lot of the mechanics in this game are ripped straight from Black Ops 3, something that could be described as either a throwback or lazy design depending on who you ask. I wouldn't know, I don't play every Call of Duty game that comes out, as I'm the type of person who can drive a car but can't afford one. That being said, from the Blops 3 gameplay I've seen, they do look fairly similar, although most of the maps in Infinite Warfare seem to be more designed around the movement abilities you're given, but hey, some of the maps seem to have been designed by a series of half-retarded leopard seals, so I suppose that's neither here nor there. And at the end of the day, I can't exactly criticize the series for taking inspiration from itself, so I'll just boil it down to a simple question. Is the multiplayer fun? And you know what? Yeah, it is kind of fun. There's something inherently joyful to me about running around on walls with a jetpack and shooting people in the face. I guess I just find it weirdly cathartic. Sure, it's not as grounded as some of the older Call of Duty games, and while I can understand why diehard fans of the series wouldn't be big on that, it's not really an issue for me. It also seems like the TTK was raised slightly, so in most cases there is more of a chance for retaliation even if you're the first one shot, which is something that I, having the situational awareness of someone who starts political arguments in the comment section of porn, can definitely get behind. However, despite the fact that I enjoy the game, it still has its fair share of flaws, like the fact that the weapon balance is such a joke that it puts anything I could possibly write about it to absolute shame. I've always thought that it was a bit downsy to give the players who are higher levels and therefore logically better at the game access to better weapons, but Infinite Warfare, in its ever-pasty wisdom, decided it'd be a great idea to double down and give the higher level players objectively better versions of every gun in the game. Now, this wouldn't be that much of an issue if the matchmaking wasn't still some of the worst in all of video games, putting 3rd and 4th prestige players in my 3rd and 4th games. And this isn't really the game's fault, but I feel like it's worth mentioning just how toxic everyone who plays this game seems to be. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy listening to grown men and pubescent teenagers yell expletives at one another between double bacon cheeseburgers and breakouts as much as the next guy, but I can't help but feel as though I'm getting dumber every time someone decides to use their microphone. And even taking into account all of the things that I like about this game, I can't even recommend it for the multiplayer because the population is dying at an alarming rate, and at this point it could be terminal. See you.